Everyone for coming here today. This is our, I think our third or fourth open meeting in Oakland, and we decided a couple months ago to change up our open meetings a little bit. Instead of just kind of talking about direct action everywhere, we're going to have a topic that was going to be presented at every meeting. And today, we have Brian Burns, who's going to talk about animal liberation in the United States. I think the original subject was radicalized vertically, and I think we'll probably still touch on that a little bit, because I think it's a great idea, and I hope we can discuss it a little. But
yeah, I think we'll discuss it afterwards.
Okay.
I just think that it's very compatible with what we've already talked about, so I don't think it would be a new idea. And
Okay.
I'll probably ramble at you with a lot of things that you already know, but I want to minimize that as much as I can. So this is a little bit different.
don't believe anything Brian says about himself when he says negative things, because he's always saying negative things are not true. But anyways, without further ado, I'm going to let Brian take the stage.
Okay. So obviously we're an animal liberation group, and I'm always stressing that this is the one thing that we should be focused on outside of everything else, because this is what we want, and this is what we will get if we take the steps that are necessary. So some of you guys were here last night for the film that we saw, and before anything, I want to stress our organizing principle number 5. We dream big and have the courage and conviction to see our dreams come true. We see beyond the next frontier. We believe in a world where the quiet oppression of complacency is replaced by the vigorous descent of a movement for change. We dream of a world where all of the animals are free. So this was kind of at the movie night we had last night. This was Caesar looking out his bedroom window. It's a very good movie.
Oh, wow.
So I already said that we need a conversation about animal liberation, and I think it's a conversation that isn't talked about much or had in most animal rights circles. And I really like this group because I think the main focus is animal liberation and not single issue campaigns, meeting people where they are, but actually more of that later. The main point that I'm going to try to advance here is that the main obstacle to animal liberation is welfarist groups. So I think that we should not be attacking the McDonald's of the world, but rather the Whole Foods, the Chipotles, the John Mackeys, the Nate Allen, Michael Pollan's of the world. Because I think that these are the people that are providing ethical justification for killing animals. These are the people that make people feel okay and complacent with the society that we live in. And I think that, I'll draw on a lot of historical examples to show that past social movements, specifically the anti-slavery movement in the 1800s, have overcome these kind of disgusting, complacent, moderate groups, and as a result have influenced massive change in kind of the social landscape at the time. Okay, so I think, especially to some of us who are new to the group, I think it's important to at least review some of our principles, and it's important to stress what we want. And we want total species equality now. And I think this gives us a marked difference from other animal liberation or other animal rights groups, because I don't think that animal liberation is even on the table for some of these groups. And we'll talk about this more later, but I think that it's very important to, one, demand total species equality, because in order to uproot a terrible system of violence and oppression, you have to strike at its ideological foundations. So I think that demanding total species equality in lieu of, for example, bigger cages or solely changes in the way in which we actually confine animals is not sufficient. I think we need to radically rethink the way that we interact with animals. And point 2 is equality now. Here, there's this quote by Martin Luther King that I think is very pertinent. And that is, a lot of these I keep using the word animal liberation when I shouldn't. A lot of these animal rights groups are actually vehemently opposed to animal liberation. There was a very popular article that was circulated just, yesterday or the day before, in many animal rights circles from one of the attendees of the National Animal Rights Conference in Washington, D.C., that just vehemently criticized the members of the animal rights community who want animal liberation now, and called them radicals, called them people that are kind of alienating the public. And I think that that's ridiculous, because like Martin Luther King says, wait almost always means never. So the full quote was written in a very famous letter called Letter from Birmingham Jail. And he did a number of things in this letter. One of the things he did was criticize the white moderates more than the actual violent KKK people in the South for trying to delay a social change. So he says, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never." And I think that immediatism is even more important for us to embrace, because for him and for his friends, they actually were undergoing violence, so they had a motivating factor to embrace immediatism, whereas we, fortunately, are not victims of the horrible oppression that's going on with animals right now. And it's even easier to slip into complacency, as we can see from kind of the state of the modern animal rights movement. So I think this is ever the more reason to get off our asses and start screaming.
That's right.
The good thing is that history is on our side, though. So, obstacles to animal liberation. So I'd say there are three things. One, speciesism. Two, power, both political and monetary. And three, welfareism. But really, I think the only real one is speciesism. I think the other two solely feed into the first. So when we talk about striking the ideological roots, we mean striking at the idea that animals are just things, that they are, in Descartes' view, automata that kind of walk around like little robots and that we can push around and do what we want with. And that because they are things, we can classify them as property. And I think that if we don't strike down speciesism, we will have no chance at striking down animal oppression. And this is the view that was taken by abolitionists in the 1800s. And okay, I'll get to that later. Sorry. Two, power. So there's this kind of commonly held position that one, industrial agribusiness has a lot of power, and two, that it's deeply entrenched in Congress. And I think these are partially true. But I think relatively, we don't have very much to go against. So we do have things like the AETA, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. We do have, massive lobbies. We have, the USDA, which is essentially controlled by farmers who kill animals. But if you look at the numbers, what is it? It's only 1.2% of the U.S. GDP is agriculture, and a subset of that is animal agriculture. If you compare this, for example, to the anti-slavery movement, slavery was much better for the economy, and Wayne pointed this out, but there's a very famous historian and kind of historical scientist who advocated taking quantitative and empirical methods to studying history. And he studied the economic problem of slavery, and his conclusion was quite controversial at the time. And it was that slavery was actually very, very, very economically viable, which makes sense, because it's free labor, right? If you don't count that in the system. And this caused quite a stir in the historical community, at least for me, you said, because there was this kind of materialist view, and there still is the materialist view that slavery died out because it was economically unviable or something like that. But this is good news for us, because one, I think the power held by modern agribusiness is low in comparison to slavery in the past. But two, that even when there is massive power on the other side, history can be decided on ideological and not just material grounds. And we have this little quote. Any of you guys either read the comic book or see V for Vendetta? There's this really awesome scene. I only saw the movie, and I feel kind of bad about it. But I think ultimately, the story that can be learned is that ideas are what matter, and that money doesn't have a lot of power in terms of social movements. So there's this scene where V says, "Well, ideas are power." And I want to go to this because there's this awesome scene where he's, at least in the movie, he gets cornered by all these policemen, and then they shoot him like at least 200 times, and he gets up, and one of the guys is like, "Why won't you die?" And he says, "Well, ideas are bulletproof." So I included this. I'm trying to see if I can pull So then he gets shot like 200 times, and then he whips out his knives, and then like kills everybody, and then leaves this one guy left. How is the volume working here? Sorry, I should have managed this. Okay, we're good.
Yep.
Die! Why won't you die? Beneath this mask there is more than flesh. Beneath this mask there is an idea, Mr. Creedy. And ideas are bulletproof.
So we're not going to go that far. I hope not. But I do think ideas are bulletproof, and I think this group is an example of that. Because I think this group is only a few months old, yet we've grown exponentially in time, and I think it's really inspiring when there are amazing ideas, and I think that can overcome money very quickly. All right, so how do I go back to the presentation? Maybe I shouldn't have switched to that.
No, I think it was worth watching the clip. Well worth it.
Thank you. So if the only battle we have to win is an ideological one, I still think that money and power can influence the ideological battle. And this is where I say is the biggest stumbling block for our movement, and that's welfarism. So we have corporations pulling millions and millions of dollars to kind of hoodwink consumers into thinking that killing animals is okay. And as an ethical proposition, that's a very hard argument to make. So, I mean, to convince people that killing animals is okay and that animals want to die, you have to have a lot of power, and you have to have zero dissent. And I think that there's very little dissent to kind of the Whole Foods style, Chipotle style rhetoric that's going on right now. And I think that once dissent comes from groups like us, the climate can change very quickly. So I want to provide kind of historical reasons why this could be true, because I don't want to just claim things and then assert that they're the case. Although I often do that anyways. So this is a detour. This is the United States in the early 1800s, and this is kind of out of a book called Of One Blood by Paul Goodman, Abolitionism and the Origins of Racial Equality. It's recommended by Wayne, who read it a while ago, and it's truly captivating. I highly recommend you read the book. Very surprising, maybe because I wasn't paying very good attention in history class, but I think, well, yeah, I actually think I remember some of it. But there were a lot of things that were surprising about the climate of the United States in the early 1800s and very late 1700s. One was that, in terms of policy, a lot of the northern states had already abolished slavery. And as a result, I thought, well, okay, well, Northerners must be against slavery, and they must be against taking people, especially due just to the color of their skin, and treating them horribly and taking away their lives. But this is actually false. So one, just kind of for context, this is a photo from Tuskegee University. It's a historically all-black university. And what happened around the 1800s was that the population of free blacks began to swell. There were a few 100,000 of them. And this concerned whites in the North. It really did. And what happened was a lot of these black communities, because of horrible defamation by a society that I'll get to in a bit, tried to, one, rise themselves up for solely kind of personal reasons, because they wanted to be wealthier, they wanted to live happier lives, but two, to counter the public opinion that blacks were naturally inferior, that they were unintelligent, that they were not capable of rising up. So as a result, a lot of these schools came about as projects to counter that opinion. So what happened? Sorry, I need to find the page. In New Haven, which was one of the most progressive towns in the country, a few abolitionist activists got together and tried to found a college for manual labor, where you could learn out of books but also do manual labor at the same time and learn trade skills so that you could easily pay your way through college. And this was kind of an egalitarian idea at the time, especially when education was often reserved for elites who could already pay for it or who had families that could pay for it. And it was supposed to be open to blacks and whites, which was a very revolutionary idea at the time. But this was in New Haven, which was one of the most progressive towns, and they expected no reaction whatsoever, and they expected it to be embraced. So here we are. By 1831, as we have seen, Jocelyn was in the forefront of the anti-colonizationist efforts to establish the Manual Labor College in New Haven. For this early convert, it was an early lesson in the obstacles abolitionism faced. New Haven roundly repudiated the effort to provide blacks with the means for self-help and eventual equality. In September 1831, the town fathers, including the foremost National Republican Jacksonian leaders, together with the voters of New Haven, assembled in a town meeting and with only 4 or 5 dissenting, Jocelyn among them, voted to resist the establishment of the proposed college in this place by every lawful means, end quote. The nearly unanimous decision at New Haven stunned the blacks and their white allies. As the home of Yale University, with the elite devoted to ameliorative theology, professing a strong interest in combating the sin of slavery, no other city had seemed to offer such fair prospects. The grounds of the rejection pulled the rug from under any hope of black improvement. The town meeting perceived the Manual Labor School as part of a program for immediate emancipation, as merely an auxiliary thereto, constituting an unwarrantable and dangerous interference with the internal concerns of other states, end quote.
For
yeah.
reference, New Haven was where?
God, why do I not know what's
Okay.
Okay, yeah. So, northern state, very progressive town, young university. So this really surprised me, and because I thought that the North was more open to the idea of emancipation, but it wasn't. But the North and South almost universally agreed that kind of, at least in the North, slavery was a problem that was meant to be dealt with by other people, and that we should not be intruding in their business. So the question was, why was that? Why was the North so apathetic? And it's because they were under the spell of this very popular and famous group called the African Colonization Society. Have any of you guys heard of the African Colonization Society? Okay, I had never heard of it, and it was actually a huge thing in the movement towards anti-slavery, but it's not as talked about.
It was the movement for anti-slavery up until the 1830s
Yeah, so up until the 1830s, when abolitionists,
in the U.S.
yeah,
At least
when abolitionists came together and said this is really wrong, the African Colonization Society had an alternate way of advocating for emancipation. And the best way that I can put it, and the best way that this book puts it, is that the African Colonization Society served as a moral fig leaf for slavery, in that it had a very vague platform for both Southerners and Northerners, slave owners and slaves, to come together and feel kind of good about doing something that didn't really do anything about slavery. So it was started by Southern slave owners in, I think it was the early 1800s. 1815. And it was the main obstacle in the way of an abolitionist movement. Many of the members and leaders of the organization not only started out as slave owners, but continued to own slaves as they campaigned with this organization. The platform for the organization was, one, we feel bad about slavery, and two, although they didn't say this explicitly, although actually in some cases they did, we're really racist and we hate black people and we don't want them in our country. So we're going to create a colony for them called Liberia in Africa and send them back. And what they were going to do is they said, okay, well, what we should do is we should convince slave owners one by one to emancipate their slaves, and we shouldn't push them too hard because otherwise they'll react negatively. In sum, it was a very popular organization. It got massive support from the United States federal government. I did the calculation. If you convert the amount of federal help that just the African Colonization Society got from the U.S. federal government, it amounts to around $1 billion in today's terms.
Wow.
In fact, they successfully started a country called Liberia, and over the course of a few decades, they sent around 20,000 blacks, both free and recently emancipated, to this country. And it's still a fully functioning country today. It's not like owned by the United States. They had an independence war. But back to the Colonization Society. There was huge black opposition, but white people didn't really care about that. And it was wildly popular because it justified racism and gave a vague solution to slavery that required no effort on anybody's part. There was a lot of effort, spent by like the United States federal government and some of the leaders of the society, and ultimately there were hundreds of chapters nationwide. But all they accomplished was, again, around 20,000 slaves, and 2 million remained. That is, it was completely ineffective at putting any dent in slavery. And all it did was kind of ideologically hush up abolitionists. So I want to read a few quotes from this book about this African Colonization Society. So, one, the American Colonization Society provided a political and ideological cover for an expansionist slave South. So, conveniently for the ACS, it was founded around 1815, which was at the time a point when the United States was expanding westward and southern states wanted to expand their slavery holdings. And it would be very convenient to have an ideological cover for expanding slavery, and an ideological reason why those who oppose slavery should shut up and not bother slave owners. From its inception, the ACS renounced any intention of interfering with slavery in the United States. What else? So this one's long. To critics such as the African Americans in Lyme, Connecticut in 1831, the ACS was simply one of the wildest projects ever patronized by a body of enlightened men. Quote, Garrison, after he saw the light in 1832, the society was, quote, a labyrinth of sophistry. Quote, and to James G. Birney, formerly a traveling agent for the society and another convert to immediatism, which was kind of the antithesis of colonization, the ACS was, quote, just an opiate to the conscience, quote. Yet hardly any whites shared these views during the organization's first 15 years, from 1815 to 1830, when its actual functions were hidden behind professions of concern for the plight of black slaves and conscientious white slaveholders. Only in retrospect did the extraordinary chameleon-like character of colonization ideology become evident, though it has long continued to mislead and confuse historians. In fact, colonizationist ideology formed a remarkable web of argument that justified the perpetuation of slavery. The most important function of the ACS was to ensure sectional harmony by offering a platform sufficiently broad and vague on which both slave owners and non-slave owners, professed abolitionists and anti-abolitionists, North and South, could stand. The removal of free blacks to Africa. This was its professed purpose, but in fact colonization served another purpose as well, removing the onus of slavery from the shoulders of Southerners. For Southerners, no objective was more important than to forestall and repress latent agitation against slavery in the free states. Colonization's architects hoped to achieve this by persuading people that gradual emancipation was feasible only if masters were encouraged to free their slaves. In colonizationist propaganda, gradual emancipation thus was made hostage to colonization. It insisted that any agitation that placed masters under moral scrutiny or political pressure or questioned their Christian benevolence would chill the inclination to manumit, which means to free slaves. Northern sensitivity to the slaveholders' feelings, therefore, was essential if the process of gradual emancipation was to go forward. Nor must one ever speak too harshly of slavery itself, the suffering of the victims and the cruelty of the master, lest slavery become a moral issue for public discussion. So I think you guys are already kind of getting into what I'm alluding to might be the equivalent of the African Colonization Society in modern times. So, in short, the situation was shitty. and it took a very large ideological confrontation to bring down the African Colonization Society. And I think that humans are very susceptible to groupthink, but at the same time, I think once dissenters emerge, people can change their opinions on especially very controversial and wacky things very quickly. And this is what happened in around 1830, when a relatively large group of abolitionists, some of whom were white and had personal experiences with blacks, which ran counter to the description of blacks given by the African Colonization Society, which were kind of these poor, meager, unintelligent creatures that needed white benevolence. So these abolitionists gathered together and wrote a scathing critique of the society. And I want to make the point that at this point, around the 1830s, the main focus of some of these abolitionists was bringing down the African Colonization Society, which at the time seemed kind of like infighting. It's like, why, we're on your side, guys, why are you attacking us? And I think this is something important to keep in mind for something that I'm going to advocate in a bit. Anyways, cool. So this is Warren Lloyd Garrison on the right. I just kind of skipped through my notes. So I want to give a quote from one of the critiques of the Anti-Slavery Society. I want to find exactly where it is. Okay, yeah. Garrison filled most of the pamphlet with block quotation of colonizationist sources, overwhelming readers with proof to buttress each of his main contentions, that the ACS is pledged not to oppose the system of slavery, that it apologizes for slavery and slaveholders, that it was nourished by fear and selfishness, and that it aimed at the utter expulsion of the blacks by disparaging free blacks and denying the possibility of elevating the blacks in this country. Throughout, he sounded the note of the prophetic scourge of sin. It was Garrison as Jeremiah. I highly encourage you to read some of this. If you look up Garrison's thoughts on the African Colonization Society. Actually, I think it's called Thoughts on African Colonization. Am I correct?
No. Thoughts on African Colonization.
Very, very powerful. So, activists and abolitionists rose together and decried the Colonization Society, and they were met with a horrible, horrible amount of criticism. So one, because this was a popular organization that had garnered support throughout the United States, they faced not only ideological criticism, but kind of personal danger. So I think his home was ransacked numerous times. He lost a lot of his white friends, and he was decried by many of the kind of leading figures of the colonization movement as, what was it, shrill and counterproductive. But ultimately, this proved to be false. So what happened was two things. One, the confrontation and ideology switched the way in which slavery was talked about in the United States. So, quoting this book again, Thoughts on African Colonization achieved two strategic objectives. It converted a crucial core of early white abolitionist leaders in rank and file more than any other work, and it triggered an extensive debate between partisans of the ACS and abolitionists that shortly sidetracked colonization as a popular movement. By 1834, following a series of debates in cities and towns of the Northeast and in the press, colonization had lost credibility among the broader public, even those not ready to embrace abolitionism, while immediatism gained momentum. So, aside from the extreme ideological shift that I think is necessary to produce a real anti-slavery movement in the United States, it also radicalized activists and created a legitimate community for abolitionists in the United States. And as a result, the movement took off. So, as you can see, Thoughts on African Colonization was, I need to remember, yes, June 1832. That's when it was published. As you can see from the chart, the number of anti-slavery societies in the United States was 4. After this, the behavior function, or the growth is literally exponential. It doubles almost every year, or it doubles every year with like an exception here. So 4 goes to 32, to 75, to 229, to 525, to 1005, to 1348 in 6 years. So I think this is something that we've talked about, but when you switch to a more uncompromising and clear ideology, you garner a lot more support. And that's one of the reasons that I actually like you people, is because I've kind of engaged with the more modern animal rights movement, and it's really disheartening. And I think that dreaming big is a really important thing, and I think it's historically proven that it works. So the question is, what do we do? Actually, can I read one more quote from Warren Lloyd Garrison? I really like this guy. This is from Thoughts on African Colonization. To impair the force of this exposition, the ardent advocates of the Colonization Society will undoubtedly attempt to evade the ground of controversy and lead uncautious minds astray in a labyrinth of sophistry. But the question is not whether the climate of Africa is salubrious, not whether the mortality among the emigrants has been excessive, nor whether the colony is in prosperous condition, nor whether the transportation of our whole colored population can be effected in 30 years or 3 centuries, nor whether any slaves have been emancipated on conditions of banishment, but whether the doctrines and principles of the society accord with the doctrines and principles of the gospel, whether slaveholders are the just proprietors of their slaves, whether it is not the sacred duty of the nation to abolish the system of slavery now, and to recognize the people of color as brethren and countrymen who have been unjustly treated and covered with unmerited shame. This is the question and the only question. So I think these are the questions that we have to ask now.
You want to paraphrase, like in modern language?
Oh, okay.
What you just said?
Do you mean in the corresponding animal rights language? Because that's what I was about to do.
Okay, sure.
So I think the question right now is not how many chickens we can save by convincing people to do meatless Mondays. I don't think that the question is, you know, how many tenths of a percent meat consumption has dropped in the past few years because of vegan outrage. I think the question is killing animals okay? And is castrating children okay? And why should humans be able to separate mothers from their children for profit? And these are the questions we need to start asking, because the current state of our movement and the current leaders of our movement are not asking these questions. These are some of the heroes of our movement, as lauded by organizations such as PETA, the Humane Society of the United States, and Vegan Outreach. Whole Foods had a Meatopia event, I think it's an annual event, where they celebrate the consumption of dead animals. And they published a manifesto for it, and here's a quote. "Every piece of meat at Meatopia is certified cruelty-free. We celebrate meat eating of every kind with the crucial caveat that the meat have lived well, been fed right, and died in a humane, respectful way. We love meat, but we love animals too." I think that was copied down incorrectly. Chipotle has the slogan, as we've talked about, responsibly raised, unconditionally loved. And as one of the presenters at the Chipotle Action noted, slow grilled as well. Wayne Pacelle, the head of the Humane Society of the United States, on numerous occasions has said things like, "I defy anyone to show me any statement where we say we want to end animal agriculture, and we are not an anti-meat organization." So I think the animal rights movement corresponds to the anti-slavery movement around the 1820s. And I think that we should not be fighting the things that everyone agrees on. I think everyone agrees that McDonald's and factory farming and Auschwitz is wrong. But I think that most people fail to realize that that's what animal abuse is all the time. And I think that most people are under the illusion of Whole Foods and Nate Appleman and Michael Pollan that we can kill animals humanely. Because that's the main response that I get when I talk to people is, oh yeah, well, factory farming is wrong, but I believe in humane slaughter. And I think, sorry, I should have mentioned this should be a discussion. I don't think anyone's said anything yet. But I want to kind of go around. Has that been your experience as well? That most of what people say is this kind of, what I would call a moral fig leaf?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I agree for the most part. But for the most part, they're like, oh, well, as long as my meat, and they don't say meat, they never say animal, is humanely slaughtered, then I'm okay with it. There's also the people who aren't even thinking about it. They're just like, oh no, I'm just going to get at McDonald's.
I think that's almost everybody.
Yeah.
I think hardly anybody in the world or the country thinks of animals as a moral issue at all.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's something I think you're ignoring here. Is you're criticizing the people who accept it as a moral issue, but then don't go as far as we want to go. But I don't know. There may be progress to get people to start thinking of how we treat animals as a moral issue at all.
I think the point of the ACS, though, was that it's not a moral issue. There's a distinction between something you do because you're nice and something you do because it's right or wrong.
Yeah.
And the HCS's position was very much, this is not a moral issue, it's a personal choice, and we can't push it as a moral issue, because that's too radical, and that's a position
But I think
Brian is challenging.
I think in the context of the modern animal rights movement, I think a lot of these groups are not trying to make it a moral issue, because a lot of these kind of utopia things, you know, all of the responsibly raised, unconditionally loved, were not started out of the volition of Chipotle, etc. They were started because of consumer reactions to factory farming. Like, I don't know, you guys saw the thing, what was it called? It was really big in the United States, Food Inc. You know, as a result of increased attention to factory farming, these kind of humane slaughter things arose. So the humane animal killing movement came about as a reaction to the public reaction to factory farming. And at least from how I interpret it, I see it as corporations trying to close up ethical inquiry about killing animals.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think that, you know, Chipotle had their factory farms one day and no one out there was questioning them. And then they said, you know what, we think it would be really important if people started questioning what we were doing was right. I think they started to do this because people were already questioning what they were doing was right, and they wanted to either shut them up or provide an ethical framework in which what they were doing was acceptable.
Well, sure, I'm not saying Chipotle are the good guys.
Yeah. No, but sorry, I'm using Chipotle as like a pronoun. Like, I mean, like, all of these people.
Yeah, the greenwashing happy meat people.
Yeah. But like, I you know, I do see where you're coming from. That I think for a lot of people, like for the HSUS, I think they view a lot of these welfare laws as gradual improvement. And I think there could be an argument for that. But I think that what they shouldn't be doing is rewarding the organizations that they work with. For example, PETA giving awards to, what was it? They gave awards to Whole Foods or,
Chipotle.
Chipotle getting awards from PETA and the Humane Society of the United States. Because what they're doing there is they're saying that killing animals is okay if you do it the right way. And I think that this is the main ideological stumbling block that we have to get over. And I think that welfarism corresponds to the African Colonization Society. And from what we've talked about, the data that we've looked at, I think that if we challenge it, we can, one, turn the moral tide of the United States, and two, garner massive support for our movement. So we only have one question left, and that is, what would William Lloyd Garrison do? So that's the end of the talk. Or actually, well, William wanted me to show another slide.
So this is actually for the open meeting efforts. I just wanted to add one other point, which is, and this is a historical point, and that is that we've kind of already gone down the welfarist path once before, because there was like an uproar in the early 20th to mid to late 20th century over kind of the condition in food, the conditions in food production, both for workers and animals. And Upton Sinclair wrote that, you know, the famous book, The Jungle, right? And so there was a movement after World War II to improve the conditions in these farm production facilities for animals and workers, and it kind of it ultimately capitalized and was successful in passing the most revolutionary federal legislation that has ever been passed in animal cruelty at any time in the country's history, which is called the Humane Slaughter Act. This was passed in 1954. It was signed by Dwight D. Eisenhower. And there's a famous quote from Eisenhower where he says, if you went by mail alone, the mail the White House is getting, you think everyone in this country is only concerned with humane slaughter. And if you know anything about the record of the Humane Slaughter Act and what has happened since 1954, it has been poked full of a billion different holes and exceptions. There's all sorts of kind of animal husbandry exceptions. The regulators aren't even allowed in the factories. And in the time span from 1954 to the present, I mean, the number of animals being killed and the condition of the animals being raised for slaughter has gotten worse and worse and worse in that 50-year period. So if you actually think that the welfarist paradigm is a successful one for leading to emancipation or liberation, the Humane Slaughter Act is a very powerful counterexample you'd have to explore. And you might say, well, there wasn't even a liberationist message then, and I don't think that's true. I think there were people who thought about this issue from the time of Jeremy Bentham, you know, like hundreds of years ago. There were people who thought that, and Pythagoras, you know, thousands of years ago, who thought that killing animals was wrong. So there was always this idea kind of percolating, and the problem was, and I think Brian raises this quite incisively in this presentation, is there wasn't a campaign. There wasn't